So now we're going to talk about article and section HTML elements, and those are both semantic elements. And we've already talked about it a little bit. And the main thing to remember about article and sections, the first thing is that articles can stand on their own, right? You could cut an article out of a newspaper and put it on your door, and it will make sense to somebody if they read it, or if it's written well too. So articles can stand on their own. And then second, just remember that newspaper analogy. So the newspaper analogy is like there's the weekend section. The weekend section has articles, and those articles in and of themselves can have sections. All right, so just remember those two things, and that's like your touchstone for using article and section. Articles stand on their own, and then just remember the newspaper. Weekend section has articles. Those articles can have sections. Okay, so let's look at some of the details of the articles. You know, one of the interesting things, so here's, right, self-contained composition, independently distributable or reusable. Sometimes they'll say, hey, you can syndicate it. That just means the same thing. But examples, it could be a forum post. That's interesting, right? A forum post. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that. It could be a magazine or a newspaper article. That totally makes sense, right? Like, yeah, of course, it's an article. I'll put in an article tag. It could be a blog entry. So blog entries are kind of like newspaper articles or magazine articles, but it's just written by some Yahoo, some individual somewhere, and they put it up on their blog. And you know, I see that like more meriting article than forum post, but hey, it's in the documentation that a forum post can be an article. Then we have a user review, and we saw that example right here in the documentation. Right here we have a film review, that's one article, and inside there we have user reviews, and those are each articles. Interesting, right? You can have articles nested within articles. And if you look at the documentation for an article, it says, what is it? Permitted content, flow content. Well, what kind of content is an article? It is flow content, right? So an article can take an article. Since an article is flow content and an article accepts flow content, you could stick an article in an article. And that's what they did here. There's articles nested within articles. So that's interesting. And then, you know, any other independent item of content and an object, right? And an object. So that's pretty vague, any other independent item of content. And so that kind of speaks to the fact that in web programming, there is no one right answer. There is ambiguity here, and some answers are more right than other answers. And so your job, what you are tasked with doing, is understanding the elements, knowing the documentation, and then to the best of your ability, like choosing the right elements, knowing your materials, and choosing the right materials to build what you want to build. And then just doing what makes sense to you within the guidelines of the documentation. And it typically includes a heading in H1 and H6 and usage notes. It gives you a couple of usage notes, right? And so this just is talking about kind of like the example we just saw. And then there's something here about address. Author information of an article element can be provided through the address element, but it doesn't apply to nested article elements. So, you know, here we could include address info for the author of this film review article, but we wouldn't include address, use that tag here since we have a nested situation. That's what that's saying. So that's the article. The interesting thing here, just looking at this page, is they've included a header, and then they have a heading inside that header, and then they have a section to hold that article, the main review, and then they have a section for user reviews. So notice what merited having the section there. If we look at section, right, there's one section in this article right here. So there's one section, and then there's the next section. So this section is the main review. This section is user reviews. And then this article has a header, and it has a footer. So that's pretty nice structure. And you wouldn't necessarily think of that. But it's like, okay, that article the content got structured pretty nicely, where we have an article and it's got a header, section, footer, done, right? And so go back to the newspaper thing, connect that to the newspaper deal. Weekend section has an article, and then that has articles, and then one of those articles could have multiple sections. So one of those articles could have multiple sections, and two of these sections are actually called section. But up here, this section is called header because that's more appropriate. And this section down here is called footer, that sectioning content, right? And so that's pretty cool. And so then within this section right here, within this section, that's made up of 2 more articles. And why? Why was article used? Because that could be a user review, and that's specifically mentioned in the documentation. And so only by knowing that, only by reading the documentation, only by knowing your materials, right? Like this kind of wood is this way, that kind of wood is that way. You want to use this kind of wood in that situation. That's craftspersonship, right? Like have a plumber come to your house and they'll be like, you can't use that piece right there. That piece is for this. You got to use this piece here. And they know that stuff. And to do this stuff well, you have to know your materials, just like any craftsperson knows their materials. All right, so then we have I don't know why I feel like I have to explain it. I guess because like I've been with a lot of students who are like, whoa, this is a lot of detail. Yeah, it is a lot of detail. So, but that's craftspersonship. All right, and then we have the section. A section is a thematic grouping of content. Typically also includes a heading, right? Usage notes do not use the section element as a generic container. This is what div is for, especially when the sectioning is only for styling. If something can stand on its own, use an article, right? And so let's go back and look at our article thing, and you can see how sections were used here to, could this stand on its own, the main review? Well, it's missing a heading, right? It's missing that title. It's just, this is like just the text of the review. So it's kind of missing some context, it's missing some context. That's the word I was looking for. All right, and then this section here, user reviews. If these 2 things stand on their own, like if A stands on its own, if B stands on its own, it seems like A and B would stand on their own, but then you have article, right? Like it's just like too many articles. So section, it's a section of this article. And when you look at it at the top level, like let's break this article into, let's, structure our document, structure our content, article, header, section, footer, end. Like that makes sense, right? Main review, user reviews. This is the user review section. This is the main review section. These don't stand on their own in context of it being part of this one structure here for structuring content, right? These don't stand on their own. Like they make more sense being a part of this one piece of structured content. This is an article, and it's got the header, section, and footer. So that's kind of how you have to think about it, and it becomes more natural as you do it. All right. So that's article and section. And the main takeaway is an article has to stand on its own. And I just bumped my mic. I was like, I bumped my mic. I hope you didn't hear that. It usually makes a wonky noise when you do that. So the main takeaways are the article has to stand on its own. So you could cut it out of the newspaper and paste it to your door. And then a section, right, is for something that can't stand on its own. So here's like, part of a section. And just take this example. I think this is a really good example for understanding how those work. So one article can have many sections, and we put a header and a footer in there. And very often, headers and footers have a heading, right? So there's a heading, and articles and sections have a heading. So I said header and footers have a heading. It's articles and sections have a heading. These don't have a heading. I might have done H3 on those because this is H2. All right, so that is a little bit about article and section.